Firstly, I would like to warn that this paper shall contain spoilers for the Mob Psycho 100 manga. I will be mostly talking about the original manga written by One, though I will also talk a bit about the Reagan spin-off. I will mention the anime occasionally, however, I do not consider the various changes that the anime has made to be truly canon. Secondly, I would like to make it clear that I do not know what One's original intent was when writing Mob Psycho 100, nor do I claim to. Thirdly, in this paper I shall be talking specifically about characters being interpreted as LGB, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, with brief mention of a character being interpreted as asexual. I will not be talking about characters being interpreted as transgender, since I feel that I am not the best person to do that. Fourthly, I shall be talking mostly about common interpretations in the fanbase and the reasons behind those interpretations. However, I will also have some mention of my own thoughts and interpretations. Fifthly, I am fully aware that I am reading too much into things. I happen to be of the opinion that reading too much into things is part of the fun of analyzing pieces of media. Lastly, I will be using screenshots from the Mob Psycho 100 manga. Please read them right to left. Teru is one character who is very commonly interpreted and portrayed in fanworks as gay or bi. Many people read him as having a crush on Mob. The Mob Psycho 100 TV Tropes character page section for Teru even includes this trope, along with some descriptions of scenes which they count as evidence, which I will be covering in detail in this paper. A lot of the reason for this interpretation of him has to do with a section of the manga commonly referred to as the Broccoli arc or Divine Tree arc, as well as the mini arc right before it. The TV Tropes page for Teru particularly draws attention to the scenes which I'm about to talk about. This particular section of the manga puts a lot of emphasis on his and Mob's relationship. In this part of the manga, Mob has become full of himself, convinced that he is becoming popular. In chapter 95, he runs into Teru while out shopping for clothes. After explaining off-screen to Teru what he is doing, Teru offers to come with him and help out. As the two are walking together, Teru notices that Mob is staring at a group of girls. He asks about it, and this is the interaction that follows. After this, Mob responds awkwardly, not sure if Teru is correct, and Teru quickly changes the subject back to their original task. The two proceed to go shopping together. Some people have interpreted the top left panel as Teru being upset at the idea that girls have begun to pay attention to Mob, and therefore that Mob might soon have a girlfriend, though it is somewhat unclear what emotion that panel is meant to convey. One thing to be noted about this interaction is that this is the only time when anyone has ever described Mob as being particularly handsome. Later in this section of the manga, Teru is brainwashed and taken hostage inside the Broccoli in an attempt to force Mob to join the Psycho Helmet cult, or at least not disband it. However, this only succeeds in making Mob angry, and when Teru is forced through the brainwashing to attack Mob, Mob uses his powers to pick Teru up and launch him out of the Broccoli. As Teru is being thrown, he says this: "The thing is, the brainwashing was supposed to make Teru respect the Psycho Helmet cult more than anything else, and it was a type of brainwashing that can only be resisted by extremely powerful emotions. While the brainwashing was still able to make Teru fight Mob, in the end, Teru's feelings of respect and admiration for Mob were proven more powerful than the brainwashing, at least to an extent." There are also various other little things in this particular arc that are sometimes taken as evidence that Teru has romantic feelings for Mob. On chapter 97, page 19, there is an interaction where Teru, under the influence of brainwashing, threatens to end his relationship with Mob if Mob does not stop trying to put an end to the Psycho Helmet cult. He then expresses his concern that if Mob were to continue trying to end the Psycho Helmet cult, the other people in the city, who are all also brainwashed, may become angry and try to attack Mob. Instead of it being completely about protecting the Psycho Helmet cult, Teru appears to be mostly concerned for Mob's safety. Dimple then explains that Teru is speaking based on his true feelings and his genuine concern for Mob. The fact that in particular translations Teru refers to his relationship with Mob, as opposed to his friendship with Mob or even his rivalry with Mob, has caused some to think that maybe Teru isn't sure how to categorize his relationship with Mob due to his feelings for Mob being more than platonic. Some also feel that when Dimple refers to Teru's true feelings, he is referring to Teru's crush on Mob. There is also the fact that he chose to use Teru as his hostage, as opposed to using Tsubomi, the girl that Mob has a crush on, which brings up the possibility that Dimple not only knew of Teru's crush on Mob, but assumed that Mob had come to reciprocate Teru's feelings. Later, on page 23, Teru speaks to Mob of his new allegiance to the Psycho Helmet cult by stating, I now simply have one additional thing that I cherish, and I have to protect that from you." Some feel that the implication with this, along with it being shown later that Teru's admiration for Mob was to an extent more powerful than the brainwashing, is that before being brainwashed, Mob and his relationship with Mob were the things which were most important to Teru. Throughout the whole manga, not counting the part before Teru's first appearance and his redemption, there are many other things which suggest that Teru may have a crush on Mob. Firstly, there is Teru's need for Mob's attention. Teru can often be seen trying to get attention from Mob, sometimes in ways which come off as somewhat flirty. The TV Tropes page calls attention to this scene, in which Teru is offering to help Mob rescue Ritsu from Claw, stating that it comes off even more flirty in the anime. The TV Tropes page also says the same thing about this scene, in which Mob expresses concern about Ritsu having to fight Claw, and Teru responds with this. Now, the thing is that Teru is already a very attention-seeking person, and it is pretty clear that the reason for this is that Teru has been neglected and effectively abandoned by his parents. Pre-Mob, Teru's way of dealing with this was by trying to get attention from the people at his school and the surrounding schools, either by trying to constantly exceed the expectations of the people around him, always being the smartest, the handsomest, and the best, to gain their praise, or by participating in gang violence and asserting power over others, gaining their admiration through fear. After Teru befriended Mob, most of his attention-seeking tendencies started to be directed at him. It could very easily be that the reason for that is simply because Mob is one of the few people Teru has managed to actually form a bond with, and that it has nothing to do with him having romantic feelings for Mob. However, considering everything else, it could very easily be that Teru having a crush on Mob is part of the reason that Mob has ended up being the person Teru has chosen to direct his attention-seeking tendencies at. Secondly, there is Teru's admiration for Mob. Throughout the manga, Teru is shown to greatly admire and respect Mob. It's clear from his first appearance after his defeat how much he admires Mob and takes everything he says to heart. Almost immediately after being defeated by Mob, he begins preaching Mob's beliefs like a new convert to a religion, excitedly preaching their newfound faith. While it takes a little while for Teru to truly change his ways and actually become humble, he almost immediately changes from disliking Mob and wanting to fight him to deeply admiring him and wanting to be his friend. In the Claw 7th Division infiltration arc, the first arc that Teru appears in after him and Mob's first meeting, Mob is defeated in a fight, and Teru is shown being shocked that that is even possible. There are various scenes throughout the manga in which Teru is shown complimenting Mob or telling other people about how great he is. One example is when, in the World Domination arc, Shimazaki brags about his power, saying that he is the most powerful Esper in the world besides Toichiro, and Teru responds by mocking him and then saying this. Later, when Shimazaki senses Mob's aura nearby, Teru says this. Another example is the situation with the shirt that Teru helped Mob pick out. As I previously mentioned, after the interaction in which Teru calls Mob handsome, the two of them go shopping together. Teru takes Mob to some of the rich people's stores, and overwhelmed by all the bizarre and expensive choices, Mob picks out the first thing he can afford that Teru points out to him, which ends up being this. A little while later, there is a scene which shows a flashback of some of the other characters, namely Teru, Ritsu, and Reigen's, reactions to Mob's choice of clothing. Ritsu and Reigen both respond by awkwardly avoiding telling Mob how bizarre the shirt is, and Mob appears to be under the impression that all three of them were being dishonest with him. However, Teru's response is completely different from the other two's. Teru appears to be genuinely complimenting Mob. There are also the scenes which I previously mentioned from the Broccoli arc, in which Teru is shown complimenting Mob and expressing his admiration for him. Now, I think that for most of the story, Teru's admiration towards Mob borders on idolizing him, which certainly isn't the healthiest thing to do, and I think that there is a point at which Teru stops doing this, specifically in Chapter 100. In Chapter 100, Teru finds Mob going on a rampage and realizes that he has completely lost control of his powers, and he responds like this. I think that this is probably the point when Teru stops idolizing Mob and begins to truly view him as an equal. After this, he only becomes more determined to protect Mob from having to suffer the trauma of accidentally hurting people with his powers again, and the nearby people from getting blasted by Mob's powers, which brings me to my next point. Teru's deep care for Mob's well-being. Teru is often shown to be protective of Mob and strongly empathetic towards him, and to have an overall tendency to try and take care of him. This is something that is shown pretty much right after Teru first starts becoming Mob's friend. After Mob is defeated by Koyama at the very beginning of the Claw 7th Division infiltration arc, Teru finds Mob unconscious in an alleyway. Teru, off-screen, takes Mob to his apartment and bandages his wounds. After Mob wakes up, Teru tries to discourage Mob from going after Claw to rescue Ritsu out of concern that Mob could get hurt or killed. Later, when Mob passes out and ends up being captured by Claw, Teru is shown checking if Mob is okay after he wakes up. Even later in the World Domination arc, Teru is shown expressing his concern to Ritsu and Reagan about Mob fighting Toichiro. After that, he is shown silently pleading for Mob to come back safely as he watches Mob fight Toichiro. And then, after the fight with Toichiro, when Mob is too exhausted to walk, Teru uses his powers to carry him. In Chapter 100, Teru finds %% going on a rampage and attempts to calm him down. When Teru realizes that talking him down isn't going to work and that Mob isn't in control of his own body, he responds like this. Before trying to use his scarf, which he imbued with his powers, to tie %, up to stop him from hurting anyone until he can calm down. Throughout the scene, he seems entirely focused on protecting Mob from having to go through the experience of accidentally hurting someone with his psychic powers again, even though he's getting badly injured. It's shown that Teru remembers seeing Mob crying alone after their fight when they first met. When Teru thinks about this and realizes that Mob might be feeling that again, he actually begins to tear up. This is the first and only time that Teru has ever begun to cry in the entire manga. When Mob regains awareness of what's going on, without regaining the ability to control his body, he sees Teru badly injured in front of him and thinks this. He appears to be realizing for the first time just how much Teru cares about him. Fourthly, there is Teru's insistence on referring to Mob as his rival, and himself as Mob's rival. This actually only happens twice in the entire manga, despite how much it is joked about by the fanbase. It first happens here in Chapter 91. Here it is very clearly being used in a jokey, affectionate way. He's complimenting Mob. Well, I think that he does genuinely think of Mob as a rival. Right here it's mostly being used as a term of endearment. The second time it is used is here in Chapter 100. Here I think he genuinely means it. At this point in the story, Teru is reaching a point where he finally views Mob as a normal person, not someone to look up to the point of practically worshipping him, but as an equal. One common interpretation in the fanbase is that part of the reason that Teru refers to Mob as his rival is that he has not yet realized that his feelings for Mob are romantic, and so he has instead ended up assuming that the more than friendly feelings that he has for Mob are just rival feelings. Fifthly, there is the possibility of Teru being jealous of Tsubomi in Chapter 101. The reason for this interpretation is this panel, which shows Teru listening to a conversation between Mob, the spiky speech bubbles, Ritsu, the round speech bubbles, and Tomei. Now, despite this only being one panel, there is still quite a bit to be discussed here. In this scene, Tomei asked Mob about his girlfriend, Tsubomi, in a somewhat teasing manner. Mob's response is shown in the panel I have here. There is really no reason for us to be seeing Teru's reaction to this conversation, but he appears to be listening closely to the conversation. His expression appears thoughtful and a little melancholy, though his expression is mostly obscured by his cup. One interpretation of this is that he is purposefully taking a ridiculously long sip to obscure his face and avoid getting visibly upset. Sixthly, there is Teru's tendency to want to be physically close to Mob. In particular, he has a habit of putting his hand on Mob's shoulder. Here are some examples. One thing to note is that he doesn't tend to be this way with anyone else. It's normal for someone with a crush to want to find subtle ways to be physically close to their crush. However, it's very possible that the reason Teru is only this affectionate with Mob is that Teru has no other close friends. Teru also tends to be the one to initiate interactions between the two of them. He will often randomly show up whenever Mob is stressed, most likely because he can sense Mob's aura and can tell from that how Mob is feeling, and will therefore seek Mob out when he thinks that Mob may need his help. This happens in the Broccoli arc when Teru comes to help Mob shop for some new clothes. It also happens twice in the final arc. First, when Mob needs advice on asking out Tsubomi, and second, when Mob is injured and %, begins destroying the city. There is also the way that Teru is often shown staring fondly at Mob in the manga, the anime, and much of the official art made by Studio Bones. This is something that is often joked about and referred to as proof that Teru has a crush on Mob, particularly when it comes to some of the official art made by Studio Bones. Now, one thing that you may notice is that people tend to interpret Teru as gay as opposed to interpreting him as bi, even though it is made clear that before meeting Mob he often flirted with girls, and he was shown with his current girlfriend of the week before him and Mob's fight. One reason why people tend to interpret him as gay is because his life pre-Mob was shown to have been very performative and unfulfilling for him. It is made pretty clear that everything that he did was to try and get people to give him the love and attention that he isn't getting from his parents, and that he tended to think of things in terms of keeping his place at the top of the social hierarchy. Going around dating and flirting with pretty girls was just another way for him to keep his place at the top. After his fight with Mob, his life is no longer centered around trying to stay at the top of the hierarchy just so anyone will even give him the time of day, and he seems to show significantly less interest in dating girls. After meeting Mob, Teru is never shown with his girlfriend, nor does he ever mention his girlfriend. He also is never shown with a new girlfriend, nor does he ever mention having a new girlfriend. He still appears to enjoy getting attention from girls, but he doesn't really show any interest in being in a romantic relationship with any of his fangirls. In Chapter 99, when Mob asks him for advice on how to ask out Tsubomi, Teru admits that he has never actually asked out a girl before, since he is often on the receiving end of love confessions. And when talking about being confessed to, he only says that it makes him kinda happy when girls give him gifts. People end up associating Teru dating girls with his life pre-Mob, which was extremely performative and focused on denying and ignoring his own emotions and issues. Meanwhile, the part of the story in which Teru is friends with Mob and appears to have a crush on him is associated with him slowly learning to open up and confront his problems and emotions. As a result of this, many people interpret him as gay instead of bi. One last thing which I would like to mention is the Season 2 OVA, which was written at least partially by One himself. One scene from the OVA is described here, listed with the ambiguously bi trope in Teru's section of the Mob Psycho 100 Characters TV Tropes page. In the actual scene, Teru was asking more generally if Mob likes anyone, before going on to ask if it was someone from his school or from his club, the Body Improvement Club. The way that this scene ended up being interpreted is that Teru was trying to subtly ask Mob if he likes guys. Many people felt that it was done in a very flirty way as well.